Hey, welcome. Today, we're going to tackle a topic that's, let's be honest, pretty misunderstood: psychosis. We're going to push past all those stereotypes you see in movies and really dig into what the research tells us. And what it tells us is that psychosis is a spectrum of human experience. It's way more nuanced and actually more common than you probably think. So let's just start by reframing this whole conversation.
What if it wasn't an on or off switch? This is really the big question for our explainer today. Instead of thinking of psychosis as something you either have or you don't, we're going to look at it as a continuum. And just shifting our perspective like this is so important because it helps us understand the whole range of experiences, from really mild stuff to the most severe. It's the first step to chipping away at this stigma.
All right, so here's our game plan. We'll kick things off by defining what this psychosis spectrum actually is. Then we'll get into the early warning signs, what a first episode looks like, and why getting a diagnosis can be so tricky. And then we'll wrap up on a really hopeful note, looking at the path to recovery.
Okay, section 1. The main idea here is that these psychotic-like experiences, well, they exist on a continuum. A lot of us have them in some small way, and it doesn't automatically mean something's wrong.
This table does such a great job of laying out the spectrum. I mean, just look at that first row on auditory experiences. On the mild end, you've got that phantom phone vibration. Who hasn't had that? Super common. Now slide over to the middle, that at-risk state. That's more like hearing some indistinct whispers a few times a week. And then all the way on the right, you get to an overt symptom where someone might hear a crystal clear voice commenting on what they're doing every single day. You see the exact same progression for beliefs, from just noticing a funny coincidence and brushing it off, to really wondering if it's a special message, to being totally certain the news is sending you secret codes. This really shows how the intensity and a person's insight into it changes along the way.
So, that brings us to that middle ground we were just talking about, the clinical state where these early warning signs become a bit more noticeable. This is what's known as the at-risk state.
And the key word here, the most important word, is risk. CHRP is not a diagnosis of psychosis. It's a way for doctors to identify young people who are showing some early signs and who could really benefit from some preventative care. It's about spotting a potential vulnerability, not predicting a definite outcome. Now, within this at-risk state, there are 3 main subtypes. And look at this. A whopping 85% of cases are what's called attenuated positive symptom syndrome, or APSS. That's really just a clinical way of saying that the most common situation is someone having milder, kind of subthreshold symptoms. The other 2, which involve brief but more intense symptoms or a known genetic risk, are way less common.
This story about Charlie is a perfect example of that APSS we just mentioned. You see, the experiences are happening pretty often and they're unsettling. But notice that last part. She can still distinguish them from reality. That bit of insight, that ability to check in with reality, is a huge factor that separates being at risk from having a full psychotic episode. Okay, and this number is so important. Only about 20 to 30% of people identified as being at clinical high risk will actually go on to develop a full psychotic disorder. That means the vast majority, 70 to 80%, do not. And that's a huge deal for reducing fear, right? It shows that being at risk is a flag for support, not some life sentence.
All right, now we're moving further along that continuum we've been talking about, to what's called first episode psychosis, or FEP. This is the point when the symptoms cross a certain threshold. That become more intense, more frequent, and have a bigger impact on someone's life.
So, the real difference here is that the symptoms become overt. Remember how Charlie could still tell her experiences weren't quite real? Well, during a first episode, that insight often fades. The experiences feel completely 100% real, and that, as you can imagine, can be incredibly distressing and confusing. To get a handle on what's happening during an episode, clinicians usually group the symptoms into 3 big buckets: positive, negative, and disorganized. It's a framework that helps make sense of a really complex experience. Yeah, so positive doesn't mean good here. It means the addition of new experiences, like hearing things that aren't there or having strong beliefs that aren't based in reality. Negative means a reduction in normal abilities, like losing motivation or not showing much emotion. And disorganized covers all the confusing thoughts that can show up as jumbled speech or unusual behavior. And this example with Alex really brings a first episode to life. You can see he's experiencing a delusion, the strong belief his boss is trying to hurt him, and he's also having auditory hallucinations, the voice that's confirming this plot. These are classic positive symptoms, and they're so frequent and severe that they're having a direct impact on his life, causing him to quit his job. Okay, so we've walked through the spectrum, the at-risk state, and the first episode. But Getting the right diagnosis, it's not always so simple. And that's because these symptoms can look a lot like symptoms of other conditions. Let's take PTSD. Someone with PTSD might be hypervigilant, right? But that feeling is usually tied directly to their trauma. The paranoia in psychosis tends to be broader, maybe less specific. Same thing with hallucinations. In PTSD, it might be hearing an attacker's voice over and over. In psychosis, the themes can be much more varied. You see, the context is everything. And then there's overlap with autism spectrum disorder. What might look like a hallucination could actually be an intense sensitivity to sound. And speech that seems jumbled might be what's called idiosyncratic speech, which is very different from the kind of illogical, tangential speech patterns we sometimes see with psychosis. It's so important to ask about specific examples to tell these things apart. So what does this all boil down to? It means that figuring this stuff out is complicated, and it really, really requires an expert. The small differences between these conditions have massive implications for treatment. That's why a careful professional assessment is absolutely non-negotiable. And that brings us to our final section, and I'm happy to say it's a very hopeful one. Because even after a first episode of psychosis, recovery isn't just possible, it's actually expected, especially when people get help early on. One of the biggest factors in recovery is something called the duration of untreated psychosis, or DUP. It's basically just the amount of time between when the overt symptoms start and when someone begins getting the right treatment. And the research is crystal clear on this. The shorter that window, the better the person's long-term outcomes are. So early action is absolutely key. A really powerful approach to supporting recovery is called psychosocial rehabilitation, or PSR. And this isn't just about taking medication. It's a whole-person framework. It's about helping people build skills, find resources, and become part of their communities again. I mean, just look at these core principles. They all point to one thing. Real recovery is about so much more than just making symptoms go away. By focusing on hope, on what a person is good at, on their own goals, the real aim is to empower people to build a life that feels satisfying and meaningful to them on their own terms. So we'll end with this question. Understanding the spectrum, recognizing the warning signs, knowing that recovery is possible, that's the first step. But the next step, well, that involves all of us. Because thinking about how we can build more informed, more compassionate communities, that is the real key to helping people not just manage an illness, but to truly thrive. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.